The early morning rush at Phoenix International Airport buzzed with anticipation as passengers, tired yet eager for the journey ahead, made their way through the boarding gate. Luggage was wheeled, coffee cups clutched in hand, and soft conversations filled the air as travelers prepared to board their flight to Los Angeles. Among the crowd, one figure stood out effortlessly: Barron Trump. At just shy of 30, he carried himself with a confidence that was immediately noticeable. In a perfectly tailored navy suit, his polished leather shoes caught the harsh fluorescent lights above, gleaming as he moved. His leather briefcase swayed slightly with each steady step he took. There was no doubt this man belonged in a different category than the average passenger. Barron wasn't just another first-class flyer. He was a product of years spent in a world of privilege, hard work, and the influence of a name that commanded attention. From the moment he entered the terminal, it was clear to anyone who looked that Barron had already established himself in the business world. Despite his youth, the air around him spoke of years of experience and undeniable success. As he moved through the crowd, his presence seemed to part the sea of travelers, though most remained absorbed in their own routines. Barron, unbothered by the bustle around him, focused solely on the task at hand, boarding the plane. As he reached the first-class cabin, Barron made his way down the aisle with ease. The other passengers, catching a glimpse of the young man in a sharp suit, were quick to notice him, but no one dared to engage. Barron didn't mind. He had never been one for idle conversation with strangers, preferring instead to settle into his seat and immerse himself in work. With a quick movement, he slid into his seat, pulled out his tablet, and began checking emails, his fingers flying across the screen with practiced ease. To the world around him, Barron was a man of importance. His reputation and family name had opened countless doors. As he scanned the emails, reviewing his latest projects, the noise and commotion of the flight seemed to fade away. His attention was fully consumed by the digital tasks in front of him. And yet, despite his focus, his surroundings couldn't help but make an impact. The passengers near him, though busy with their own affairs, couldn't help but glance his way. But Barron paid them no mind, his thoughts wrapped in the work that lay ahead. Just as Barron began to settle in, another man walked down the aisle, a man who couldn't have been more different from Barron, where Barron exuded sharp lines of success. This older man was dressed simply. His tan jacket, plaid shirt, and worn loafers didn't fit the typical profile of a first-class passenger. He moved with a quiet grace, unbothered by his surroundings, and took a seat a few rows away from Barron. The older man's presence caught Barron's attention almost immediately. His modest attire and quiet demeanor seemed out of place in the polished environment of first class. It was obvious to Barron that the man didn't belong there, not in the same world, not in the same class. Barron's internal judgment flickered, and he couldn't resist making a comment. Leaning forward, ensuring the older man could hear, Barron said with a mocking smirk, "Looks like first class isn't as exclusive as it used to be." He half expected a reaction, maybe an apology, perhaps a flinch, but instead, the older man did nothing. He simply gave Barron a fleeting, almost invisible smile and turned his gaze back to the window. The lack of reaction from the older man struck Barron in an unexpected way. He wasn't used to being ignored, to his attempts at provocation being met with complete indifference. It frustrated him more than he cared to admit. His sense of superiority began to grow as he thought about the situation. And Barron, unable to let it go, pressed on. "What's the occasion? Did they hand out charity upgrades today?" he asked, his voice sharper this time, dripping with condescension. Barron was certain the older man would at least react, feel uncomfortable, or perhaps respond with something akin to a defense. But once again, the older man did nothing. He simply adjusted his seatbelt and kept staring out the window. Barron felt a growing irritation. The older man's silence and refusal to engage only fueled Barron's arrogance. He couldn't stand the thought of someone who seemed so unmoved by his jabs. The rest of the flight continued with its usual hum, the rustle of newspapers, the occasional call button, the light chatter of other passengers. But Barron's attention was solely fixed on the older man. Something about him gnawed at Barron. It wasn't just the silence. It was the calm confidence that radiated from the older man. He wasn't desperate for validation. nor did he seem to care about the judgment of others. Barron's frustration grew. He couldn't let this go. He needed to assert his superiority. As the plane climbed to cruising altitude, Barron leaned forward again, determined to get a reaction. This time, he raised his voice just enough for a few of the passengers to hear. "I'm curious," he began with a forced smirk. "What brings someone like you to first class? Big lottery win? Or are you here to talk about the good old days when planes were still powered by propellers?" The nearby passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly aware of the tension brewing, but still, the older man did not react. He took a slow, deep breath, then glanced toward Barron with a steady gaze. Their eyes met for just a brief moment before the older man turned back to the window, seemingly unfazed by Barron's words. Barron's frustration had now reached its peak. He couldn't understand why this man refused to respond. But just as Barron leaned back in his seat, thinking he had won whatever imaginary battle he had created, the moment came, the moment that changed everything. The flight attendant, approaching with the beverage cart, paused at the older man's seat. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, her tone warm and respectful. "Would you like coffee or tea?" The name hit Barron like a lightning bolt. Eastwood, Clint Eastwood. Barron's eyes widened as the realization slammed into him. The older man he had been mocking wasn't just any regular passenger. He was Clint Eastwood, one of the most iconic actors and directors in Hollywood history. A ripple of whispers started to spread through the cabin. Passengers turned their heads, some whispering excitedly, "Is that really him?" Barron's face drained of color. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been insulting Clint Eastwood, a man whose reputation preceded him in every room he walked into. A man who had earned the respect Barron had so thoughtlessly dismissed. The weight of his mistake pressed down on Barron. For a moment, he sat frozen in disbelief, his arrogance crumbling around him. Finally, he managed to speak, his voice quiet and apologetic. "Excuse me, Mr. Eastwood," he stammered. Eastwood turned slowly, meeting Barron's gaze. "Yes," he replied calmly, his voice steady. "I didn't realize. I'm sorry," Barron murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Eastwood studied him for a moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. With no further words, he turned back to the window, signaling that the conversation was over. But for Barron, it was far from over. The realization of what he had done, mocking a living legend without even knowing who he was humbling. It was a lesson in humility that Barron would carry with him long after the flight ended. As Barron Trump settled into his first-class seat, the hum of the boarding gate still lingering in the back of his mind, the doors to the cabin opened, and a new passenger walked in. At first glance, he didn't fit the profile of someone who belonged in this space. His appearance was a far cry from the tailored suits, crisp shirts, and polished leather shoes that filled the cabin. Instead, he wore a simple tan jacket over a plaid shirt, paired with worn loafers that had clearly seen better days. The older man moved through the aisle with a slow, purposeful gait, carrying only a small, humble bag that he placed gently beneath the seat in front of him. Barron couldn't help but notice how out of place this man seemed. His entire demeanor, the casual, unhurried pace with which he walked and settled in, struck Barron as completely opposite to his own energy. Barron was no stranger to the world of business, the world of prestige, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the man had no business being here. In first class, surrounded by people dressed in luxury, his simple attire stood in sharp contrast to Barron's carefully crafted, polished look. Everything from his suit to his shoes screamed success, and Barron had always prided himself on the way he presented himself to the world. But this older man, sitting there so calmly, was a direct contradiction to everything Barron stood for, or so it seemed. As the man settled into his seat, Barron leaned back slightly, trying to make sense of what he was witnessing. The older man didn't seem flustered or self-conscious at all. He simply adjusted himself, fastening his seatbelt with a quiet grace before looking out the window. There was something about that calmness that both unsettled Barron and intrigued him. In a world where success and status were everything, this man's indifference to appearances was almost jarring. Unable to let go of his thoughts, Barron shifted in his seat and leaned forward. just enough so that the older man could hear him. With a smirk playing on his lips, he muttered, "Looks like first class isn't as exclusive as it used to be." His words hung in the air, dripping with condescension. A few heads turned in his direction, but the older man didn't budge. He didn't flinch, didn't react with even a hint of discomfort. Instead, he simply offered Barron a faint, almost imperceptible smile before returning his gaze to the window. The lack of reaction from the older man was, in Barron's mind, a challenge. It wasn't what he had expected. Barron had assumed that, with his comment, he would provoke some response, a raised eyebrow, perhaps a defense of his place in first class. But instead, the older man's unruffled silence was like a mirror to Barron's own sense of superiority. It didn't sit well with him. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Barron prided himself on his ability to make others feel small if they didn't fit in with the polished world he occupied. And yet, here was a man who didn't seem bothered at all. Barron's irritation began to rise. He wasn't used to being so easily dismissed. His world, a world of business dealings, luxury, and expectations, had never encountered a person like this. The older man's quiet composure seemed to mock Barron's own constant need for validation. The young businessman wasn't one to back down, not from something as simple as a minor jab. So, Barron tried again. This time, his voice was louder, sharper. "What's the occasion? Did they hand out charity upgrades today?" His tone was more biting, full of mockery, as he tried to provoke some kind of reaction. Surely, with that kind of jibe, the older man would at least defend himself. But again, the older man did nothing. He merely adjusted his seatbelt and turned his eyes back to the window. It was as though Barron wasn't even worth responding to. The lack of any response from the older man only fueled Barron's anger. How dare someone, especially someone so out of place in this world of exclusivity, ignore his attempts to belittle them? His frustration built, the silence in the cabin seeming to grow louder with every passing moment. Here he was, sitting in first class, a man who had climbed the corporate ladder, earning his place in the world, and yet, this older man had the audacity to remain calm, to remain unaffected by his jabs. To Barron, it felt like an affront to everything he had worked for. And so, Barron leaned forward once more, determined to provoke a response, desperate to see the older man break even just a little. "I'm curious," he said, this time louder than before, his voice oozing with mockery. "What brings someone like you to first class? Big lottery win? Or are you here to reminisce about the good old days when planes were still powered by propellers?" This time, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their glances darting between Barron and the older man. But still, the older man didn't react. He took a slow, deliberate breath and then turned his head just slightly. His eyes met Barron's, and for a brief moment, Barron felt a flicker of something, a quiet recognition that his words hadn't had the effect he'd hoped for. The older man simply looked back out the window, his calmness unshaken. Barron sat back in his seat, his chest tightening with a mixture of frustration and confusion. What was it about this man? Why wouldn't he respond to his provocation? But little did Barron know, that moment of silence, the calm, collected silence of the older man, was about to turn into something far more powerful than any response could have been. It was at that moment when the flight attendant approached. She stopped by the older man's seat, and with a warmth that Barron had not expected, she asked, "Mr. Eastwood, would you like coffee or tea?" The name hit Barron like a bolt of lightning. Eastwood, Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor, the man whose films and achievements had shaped Hollywood for decades. Barron's smirk faded, his eyes wide with realization. He had just insulted one of the most iconic and respected figures in entertainment history. And worse, he hadn't even recognized him. As whispers started to ripple through the cabin, Barron's heart sank. He looked around, his face drained of color as the realization settled in. The older man wasn't just some random passenger. He was Clint Eastwood, someone whose name carried weight, whose reputation had earned him the respect that Barron had failed to see. The passengers around him began to murmur excitedly. "Is that really him?" one woman asked. "I think it's Clint Eastwood," another whispered. Barron's arrogance crumbled. The weight of his actions, of having mocked a man who was not only deserving of respect but had earned it through decades of wisdom and experience, began to settle in. His mouth went dry as he tried to come to terms with the truth. He had disrespected someone far more accomplished. And worse, he hadn't even realized who he was. Barron, now feeling a sense of entitlement to a reaction, leaned in again. His tone was cutting, a little sharper. As he spoke, "What's the occasion? Did they hand out charity upgrades today?" He expected something this time, an uncomfortable shift, a flash of defensiveness, anything to make him feel justified in his words. But the older man remained as composed as ever, his only movement being the subtle adjustment of his seatbelt. He didn't respond, didn't even give Barron the satisfaction of a glance. Barron's irritation built in the silence. The older man's complete lack of reaction was more than just frustrating. It was unnerving. Barron wasn't accustomed to being ignored, especially when he felt like he had the upper hand. The sharp remarks, the digs, they were all part of the territory. But here, in this moment, the older man's calm was a stark contrast to Barron's increasing agitation. Every ounce of Barron's attention was fixated on the man who didn't care. He had failed to provoke him the first time, and now felt the overwhelming need to assert himself once again, to show he was still in control of the situation. The older man's indifference seemed to trigger something deep in Barron. Why wouldn't this man react? Was Barron's power and status, his carefully honed persona, so irrelevant to someone who was so clearly out of place? Barron felt small. The sting of being dismissed like this was growing unbearable, and he wasn't ready to back down. There had to be something he could do to break through this impenetrable calm. With a sudden, sharp move, Barron leaned forward once more, his words full of edge. "I'm still wondering, what brings someone like you to first class? Did you hit the jackpot? Or are you just here for a nostalgic trip down memory lane when planes used to fly on propellers?" The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. He wanted to see the older man flinch, shift, maybe even frown, anything. But the older man remained unmoved, not even sparing him a second glance. Instead, he calmly straightened his jacket, as if Barron wasn't worth the trouble of engaging with. The frustration inside Barron reached a boiling point. Every attempt to provoke this man was met with absolute silence, and that silence was eating away at him. He wasn't used to feeling so disregarded, so completely irrelevant. The older man's complete lack of interest, his refusal to indulge Barron in his game, sent waves of humiliation crashing against Barron's defenses. How could someone so seemingly inconsequential make him feel this way? How could someone so unremarkable be so unaffected by his sharp tongue? As Barron sat back in his seat, fuming, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter, this simple exchange of space in first class, had turned into something deeper. The older man's presence, calm and quiet, had become a reflection of Barron's own insecurities, and it was that reflection that he couldn't bear to face. His need for validation, his constant desire to prove himself better than others, had never been so clearly exposed as weak and foolish. He couldn't let it go. The silence gnawed at him, and Barron was desperate for some kind of release, some sign that his words had carried weight. But just as he was about to speak again, the flight attendant approached, pushing the beverage cart down the aisle. Barron was too distracted by his own frustration to notice the significance of the moment at first. But then the attendant stopped by the older man's seat, and Barron's world came to a sudden, crashing halt. "Mr. Eastwood," the flight attendant said, her voice warm, respectful. "Would you like coffee or tea?" The name hit Barron like a thunderclap. Eastwood, Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor, the director, the icon. The reality of the situation crashed into Barron's mind like a ton of bricks. The man he had been mocking, so unaware, so dismissive, was none other than Clint Eastwood, a living legend, the man he had insulted without a second thought, the man he had belittled with his sharp words and jabs, was a giant in Hollywood, a figure who had shaped an entire era of cinema. Barron's heart sank as he realized the depth of his mistake. The cabin seemed to collectively hold its breath as the truth began to spread. Murmurs filled the air. "Is that really him?" someone whispered. "I think it's Clint Eastwood," another voice answered. Barron's face went pale as the full weight of his ignorance and arrogance settled over him. He had mocked Clint Eastwood, a man who deserved nothing but the utmost respect, and he had done so without even realizing who he was. The people around him began to exchange knowing glances, whispers spreading like wildfire, all while Barron remained frozen in his seat, unable to fully process the reality of what had just unfolded. Barron's mind raced, a sickening sense of embarrassment washing over him. He had belittled a man whose name carried more prestige and respect than any business deal Barron had ever made. His own words, his sharp remarks, now felt like daggers lodged deep in his chest. What had he done? How had he failed to see the man sitting right next to him for who he truly was? After what felt like an eternity, Barron found his voice again, his words stumbling out in a quiet, contrite tone. "Excuse me, Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The older man turned to face him, his piercing gaze calm but powerful, as if he had already read Barron's every thought. "Yes?" Eastwood replied simply. Barron opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The realization of how foolish he had been overwhelmed him. "I didn't realize," he stammered, his voice faltering with embarrassment. "I didn't know who you were. I'm so sorry." The weight of his apology hung in the air, but Eastwood didn't say anything immediately. He regarded Barron for a moment, his silence speaking volumes. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Eastwood gave a small nod, acknowledging Barron's apology without any bitterness or malice. And just like that, he turned back to the window, signaling that the conversation was over. Barron sat back in his seat, stunned and humbled, as the lesson Eastwood had delivered quietly reverberated through him. It wasn't about titles. It wasn't about wealth or status. It was about how you treated others, how you treated people, regardless of who they were. That quiet dignity, that ability to remain unshaken, was the true source of respect. And for the first time, Barron understood that lesson all too well. Barron's voice cut through the cabin, carrying just the right amount of edge to ensure the older man would hear his jab. "What brings someone like you to first class? Big lottery win? Or maybe you're just here to reminisce about the good old days when planes were still powered by propellers." He leaned back in his seat, watching for the flicker of discomfort that he expected to see in the older man's eyes. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted slightly, as nearby passengers exchanged uneasy glances. But to Barron's disbelief, the older man didn't flinch. He simply exhaled slowly, adjusting his posture as if Barron's words hadn't even touched him. Then, with deliberate calm, he turned his gaze toward Barron, his eyes meeting his for just a moment. The quiet strength in those eyes was enough to stop Barron in his tracks, though the older man said nothing. After the brief exchange, he turned back to the window, as composed and unaffected as ever. The lack of reaction left Barron feeling strangely unsettled. There was no anger, no sign of vulnerability. It was as if Barron's words had not even registered. To Barron, who was used to people responding to his dominance, whether through irritation, resentment, or at least an acknowledgement, this indifference felt like an open challenge. The older man's unshaken calm seemed to strip Barron of the control he had come to expect. He wasn't sure why, but something deep within him stirred. He felt a slight ripple of fear, a realization that perhaps his own confidence, built on external markers of success, was much shakier than he'd ever been willing to admit. As the flight continued, Barron's irritation grew. The older man remained the same, unperturbed, quiet, and seemingly immune to Barron's attempts to provoke. His presence, a mixture of silent dignity and unbothered poise, gnawed at Barron's confidence. The older man wasn't trying to be dominant or assertive. He simply was. It was a quiet power that Barron secretly feared, the kind that didn't need to demand attention but still commanded it. It was something Barron couldn't fathom, a presence so grounded and certain that it made his own efforts to prove himself feel meaningless. And that uncertainty, that disquiet, made him want to double down on his attempts to regain control. It wasn't until the flight attendant passed with the beverage cart that Barron's world tilted completely. She stopped next to the older man, who was still gazing out the window, calm as ever. With a respectful tone, she addressed him, "Mr. Eastwood." Would you like coffee or tea? The words hit Barron like a freight train. Eastwood. Clint Eastwood. The legendary actor, the icon. It took a moment for Barron to fully process it, and when the realization hit, his stomach dropped. His eyes widened in disbelief as the truth slowly unfolded in front of him. The man he had been mocking, the one who had so easily brushed off his taunts, was Clint Eastwood, the man whose name resonated with authority and respect. The same Clint Eastwood who had built a legacy in Hollywood, a living legend, who had quietly endured Barron's insults without ever breaking his calm. The hum of the cabin seemed to quiet for a moment as the passengers around Barron began to whisper excitedly among themselves. "Is that really him?" one woman asked in a hushed tone. "I think it's Clint Eastwood," came the reply. The realization spread quickly through the cabin, and Barron felt the weight of his mistake crash into him with full force. His own words, once so sharp and confident, now felt like daggers lodged deep in his chest. Barron sat frozen in his seat, feeling both a deep sense of humiliation and an overwhelming sense of shame. He had mocked a man of unparalleled achievement and dignity. And worse, he hadn't even realized who he was talking to. The sense of regret washed over him, and for a moment, he couldn't find the words to apologize or even begin to process what had just happened. As the realization continued to sink in, Barron's initial reaction gave way to deep, silent contemplation. The man he had so carelessly ridiculed had become a mirror for Barron's own insecurities. Here he was, a man who had built his life on external markers of success, money, power, prestige, belittling a man who had earned his respect, not through anything external, but through the quiet strength of who he was. Barron's entire approach to success now seemed shallow in comparison to the older man's lived experiences. Feeling the weight of his own pride crumble, Barron finally gathered enough courage to speak. "Excuse me, Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Clint Eastwood turned his head slowly, his piercing gaze meeting Barron's for a moment. "Yes?" Eastwood replied simply, his voice calm, steady, and unwavering. Barron swallowed, his throat tight, and tried to speak. I didn't realize," he stammered, feeling embarrassed and exposed. "I didn't know who you were. I'm so sorry." Eastwood took a moment, regarding Barron without anger or resentment. He simply nodded slightly, acknowledging the apology without much more. There was no lecture, no rebuke, just a quiet understanding in the older man's gaze. And then, as if the moment had already passed, Eastwood turned his attention back to the window, signaling the end of their brief exchange. Barron sat back in his seat, the weight of Eastwood's quiet wisdom settling heavily on his chest. He didn't need to say more. The lesson had already been delivered, more powerfully than any harsh words could have ever accomplished. It wasn't about titles or wealth. It wasn't about who you were or what you had. True respect came from how you treated others, how you carried yourself with humility, kindness, and dignity. Barron hadn't known that until now, and it left him with a deep sense of change stirring within him. The rest of the flight passed in silence, but Barron's mind was far from quiet. His thoughts circled around the man who had so easily shut down his arrogance without a word. He began to rethink the way he had been living, the way he had been treating others, and the way he had measured his worth. This encounter, this moment with Clint Eastwood, would stay with him long after the plane landed. Barron was ready to change. For the first time, he was ready to be the kind of person who deserved respect, not because of what he owned or who he knew, but because of the way he treated others. And in that moment, Barron knew he had just learned one of the most valuable lessons of his life. The older man he had been mocking wasn't just any elderly passenger, he was Clint Eastwood, one of Hollywood's most iconic figures. The realization hit Barron hard, and his smirk vanished. His face drained of color as passengers began whispering excitedly around him, confirming what he had just discovered. "Is that really him?" someone asked. "I think it's Clint Eastwood," another murmured. Barron sat frozen, the weight of his mistake sinking in. He had been insulting a living legend, someone whose name carried more respect than Barron could ever hope to achieve. He had belittled a man who had earned his place not through wealth or superficial status, but through decades of hard work and integrity. Barron felt his stomach drop as the reality of the situation became undeniable. He found the courage to speak, his voice quiet and hesitant. "Excuse me, Mr. Eastwood," he said, stammering. Eastwood turned slowly, his piercing eyes locking with Barron's. "Yes," he replied, his voice calm, unbothered. I didn't realize." Barron stuttered. "I'm sorry. I didn't know who you were." Eastwood regarded him silently for a moment before giving a small, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't need to say more. The lesson had already been delivered. Without another word, he turned back toward the window, signaling that the conversation was over. But for Barron, the lesson wasn't over. The weight of his arrogance settled heavily on him. He had been so quick to judge the older man based on appearances, on clothes, on superficial factors. And now, faced with the truth, he couldn't escape the shame of his behavior. Barron took a deep breath. Trying to calm himself, he gathered the courage to speak once more. "If I wasn't who you thought I was, would that have made the way you spoke to me okay?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with genuine remorse. Eastwood's response came quickly, the question sharp and clear. "If I were just some ordinary guy in a plaid shirt, would that have made what you said okay?" Barron opened his mouth to speak, but was struck dumb by the simplicity and power of the question. It forced him to confront his own hypocrisy and assumptions. He hadn't treated the older man with respect because he hadn't believed him to be worthy of it. And now, with the truth staring him in the face, Barron had no defense. "I guess not," Barron finally whispered, his voice barely audible. Eastwood nodded slightly, acknowledging the response without further comment, and returned to his quiet contemplation by the window. The flight continued, but Barron had been changed. The lesson he had learned wasn't one he could easily forget. As the plane touched down in Los Angeles, he found himself reflecting deeply on his actions, on how he had treated others based solely on what they looked like or what he assumed their worth was. Barron Trump, once so sure of his superiority, had been humbled by a simple, quiet man. In that moment, Barron realized that respect isn't something you earn through wealth or titles. It's something you give freely, to everyone, regardless of who they are or what they have. And for the first time in a long while, Barron was ready to embrace that truth.